Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Remington. I'm the WAFWA Sagebrush Science Coordinator. And let me bring up my slides here. Okay, and I want to thank everyone for participating today, and I'll thank you in advance for your participation in the future. It's really important that as we develop a sagebrush network governance system, that we hear from a broad perspective of viewpoints and a lot of the different stakeholders that we would like to participate in this governance system. So I want to give you some background. For those of you that don't know what WAFWA is, WAFWA is the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It was established in 1922, initially as a collection of state wildlife agencies, but it has broadened to truly represent all of the Western Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the natural resource agencies at state and federal levels. And the idea of a sagebrush network governance concept that we're going to talk about today in our future meetings will be part of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy that WAFWA is helping coordinate the development of. So I wanted to give an introduction to what that Sagebrush Conservation Strategy is, and so that you understand how this all fits together. And the concept for a Sagebrush Conservation Strategy, I need to go back a little bit in history. And as most of you, I'm sure, are familiar, the 2000s has basically been the era of emphasis on sage-grouse conservation because of listing petitions in the past, and the emphasis of state agencies and federal agencies and NGOs really was on sage-grouse conservation. And all of us recognized that we really at some point needed to get past sage-grouse and manage sagebrush rangelands and sagebrush biome in a broader context, because there's lots of other species and lots of other needs from that system beyond sage-grouse. So we had a lot of momentum and a lot of excitement coming into 2015 when the service found sage-grouse were not warranted for listing. And so there were a couple of initiatives that were ongoing at that time that this sagebrush conservation strategy really evolved out of. One was the Sagebrush Science Initiative that the Fish and Wildlife Service had, which collaboratively with WAFWA, which was to develop science, sort of anticipating this expansion from a sage-grouse focus to a sagebrush biome focus and other sagebrush-dependent species. And the other was the Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy that DOI coordinated the development of, and some key science products that came out of that, including the concepts of resistance and resilience as a framework for management into the future. And they initially started with a sage-grouse focus for obvious reasons, but their intent all along was to expand that focus to include the rest of the species within the biome and the rest of the biome. So they were helpful to help support the strategy, Sagebrush Conservation Strategy development, as an expansion and an updating of that Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy. So the idea was to look forward to a broader focus in the sagebrush biome. And I'll talk about what that looks like here in a second. But I also wanted to mention in this slide that the strategy is being developed under the auspices of the Sagebrush Executive Oversight Committee, or EOC, and you'll hear about that as we go forward, I think. But it's a group of state and federal leaders, and it's a committee that WAFWA oversees. So this is Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, state wildlife agencies, NRCS, USGS. And the reason that that's important is because whatever we come up with, either for the sagebrush strategy writ large or for governance in particular, it's going to be their document, and the likelihood of our ideas being implemented, I think, is really, really high. They're at least going to get a very fair hearing by that group, and it carries a lot of gravitas when it's endorsed by that Sagebrush EOC. So quickly, the plan for today is to explain how this governance concept fits into the larger Sagebrush conservation strategy effort. So I will try to do that. Then Udall folks have been working on a couple of critical pieces of information that will help us as we try to develop this collaborative governance model. So they're going to tell you about the findings of their assessment interviews. Many of you were interviewed, and that's really key. The caveats and constraints and concerns that you have need to come forward. And they'll also tell you about the findings of research into other large-scale landscape collaborative governance models and how that can be insightful as we move forward. And then finally, they'll explain the process moving forward so you have a sense of how that's going to work. So stepping back a little bit, why was the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy necessary? Well, it's because issues that cause conservation concern for sage grouse are not unique to sage grouse, and we all know that. In fact, Wisdom et al. In the eco-regional assessment they did for the Great Basin identified 735 species that occurred within sagebrush habitats in the Great Basin. 63 of those were vertebrate species with some level of conservation concern. And we also know that sagebrush is a critical habitat component for many species that are not necessarily of conservation concern, but are highly valued for hunting or aesthetics, like mule deer, pronghorn elk, and bighorn sheep. And as importantly, sagebrush plant communities support ranching economies, watersheds, and recreation throughout the West. So the objectives of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy were to analyze and then communicate the importance of the sagebrush biome to wildlife and to humans, analyze and communicate the threats to that biome, and analyze and communicate the opportunities and challenges associated with conserving the biome. Second, to update and expand, as I said, the emphasis of the DOI, Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy. And in that respect, the idea was to create a one-stop shop for science related to sagebrush. What do we know? What other sources of information are available? And we've tried to do that, as you'll see. And finally, to create a roadmap to sagebrush conservation. What do we need to do? Where do we need to do it? In what manner and how much, to the extent that we can determine that, and also to incorporate social science and human needs into the equation. We're not managing wildlife solely. We want to make sure that we consider and accommodate human needs from that landscape as well. A couple of specific questions we wanted to answer in that process were, do management prescriptions for sage grouse adequately protect other sagebrush obligate or dependent species? And how far do sagebrush conservation's either protections or actions take us for other species, excuse me? And conversely, will management actions for sage grouse such as conifer removal negatively impact other species of concern like pinyon jays? So that's what it was intended to be, what it was not intended to be, and that applied to the strategy writ large, but also to the governance component of it. We want this to be a strategic science-based guidance. It's not a plan that commits resources, it's advice to decision makers, and we want the governance model to be conveyed in that same aspect. It's advice and not an answer or not a decision, but approaches that can be used. We want it to address voluntary conservation actions, to identify options and alternatives. We're not going to get into the regulatory piece at all. We're not intending to create a governance system that assumes or usurps anybody's authority or responsibility at all. This is on the collaborative side, the voluntary side. And we want this to be comprehensive, collaborative. We want it to address sort of an all lands, all hands approach. We don't want the actions to stop at any borders. I'm really pleased to announce that as of today, part one of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy is published as a USGS open file report, and it's available at that link, which I put into the chat. And for those of you that may have joined a little after I did that, we'll put it in again. I'm sorry to say that the USGS website crashed today, and I don't think it was because of this. I think it was coincidental, but that link is the correct link. And if you try to access the report, and I strongly encourage you to do that, you may get an error message, but it will work hopefully by the end of the day. So part one of the strategy, and we split the strategy into two pieces because it just got so big, we kind of had to. But part one is a contextual analysis of human and wildlife needs from the system, conservation threats or change agents in the biome, and then other conservation challenges such as restoration, clearly a big one, adaptive management and monitoring, communication, things like that. And it also, within that, discusses conservation gaps and some potential approaches. But the strategic part of the strategy, what strategies we're recommending, will come out in part two of the strategy. And I also wanted to mention that this was a huge effort. We had 94 authors representing 34 different groups. There were actually probably double that that were involved in discussions. The 94 authors, the ones that put pen to paper, there were many, many more that contributed to discussions that ultimately got captured but weren't named authors. So I'm not going to review part one of the strategy at all, but I did want to highlight some things that relate to governance. One is that this human need, and I think in some of our earlier talks, Sean was the one that highlighted that we conserve landscapes and we conserve wildlife for people, and we need to keep that in mind. We're not trying to save individual sagebrush plants for the sake of that individual plant. We're doing it for ourselves, and that's necessary for those conservation actions to be successful. But humans have derived a lot of benefits, both socially and economically, from sagebrush landscapes. This is from the second chapter of the part one, the human dimensions chapter, and it uses an ecosystem service approach to sort of bundle those human benefits from sagebrush. And I'm not going to go through them, but some of them are pretty obvious. Grass production in support of livestock, a huge benefit in the West, recreational opportunities, not just hunting and wildlife viewing, but cycling and hiking and other things, but also the water purification, water infiltration, contributions to our watersheds, and also carbon sequestration, which I think is something we can use to our advantage moving forward. So part two describes all of the change agents in the sagebrush biome and describes their extent, their impacts to both wildlife and plant communities, and to some degree our efforts to address them. And all of these are really potential components of a governance system in terms of coordinating our responses to these, with the potential exception of the free roaming equids, which is really up to Congress. But so why are we here? The reality is any one of these, but certainly all of these in aggregate, are bigger than any of us can handle alone. We have to find a way to collaborate, and that leads to a collaborative governance. So some of the other key findings from the strategies that sort of explain why we're here. We have too much fire in the sagebrush system, and at present our efforts to either prevent them, suppress them, or restore burned landscapes after fire are not keeping pace. We're burning what's actually tracked as sage-grouse habitat that burns, not acres of sagebrush, but it's a pretty good proxy for the amount of sagebrush fires. And we're burning about 1.2 million acres of sagebrush per year. And that amounts to almost 1% of the sage-grouse habitat is burning annually. And not all of that, certainly some of that would recover in the absence of a restoration effort, but Too much of it will not, or at least in any sort of near term, without restoration efforts, and our restoration efforts to date are way short of that total. And we have a system that, particularly in the Great Basin, is really ecologically out of balance, or in portions of the Great Basin, where we have this familiar cheatgrass wildlife fire or cycle where cheatgrass begets wildfire, which begets more cheatgrass, which begets more wildfire, and in some cases leads to a type conversion from a sagebrush shrubland to an annual grass type. That's essentially irreversible without massive restoration efforts. And the climate change chapter makes it clear that that's going to get much worse in the future. Those trends are going to accelerate. And it's something we're going to have to get our hands around. Conversely, at higher elevations and cooler, moisture sites, too little fire has led to conifer expansion since settlement. And that one of the reasons I bring it up is because it's it has been a huge emphasis of the NRCS Sage Grouse Initiative, the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative, and SageCon in Oregon. And yet, despite our best efforts at addressing this problem, our conifer removal efforts are, I think, 87% in 3 states. And even so in aggregate, we're just keeping pace with the rates of expansion. So in those other states that aren't really addressing it, we're losing ground at a pretty good clip. And of the conifer that's been removed in the last 5 or 6 years, over a third of that removal was attributed to wildfire as opposed to our conservation actions. So even with conifers, which has been a real area of emphasis, we're coming short of what's needed. So to sort of sum up the threat portion, part 1 makes it abundantly clear that while we are winning many battles at local scales, and the sum of our individual actions is not adequately addressing the threats or restoring degraded sagebrush rangelands at biome scales. So we're at risk of winning local battles, but losing the overall war. So the purpose of a Sagebrush Network governance effort is to see if we can create a governance body that can increase effectiveness by coordinating activities within and across scales, develop and adopt common conservation objectives to meet human and wildlife needs, and that those objectives then step down to a prioritized landscape for conservation emphasis, because we know even if we are successful at obtaining more resources, resources are always going to be limiting. That prioritization piece is going to be huge. And hopefully this governance body can increase available resources by pooling resources, leveraging, and by collectively informing decision makers of the urgent need for more capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. So part 2 of the strategy is the strategies themselves. It's currently under development. It's going to include sections on increasing capacity for sagebrush conservation, examples where capacity has been increased through collaboration and pooling and leveraging resources, number of models out there that are really outstanding and can make a difference if we can figure out a way to stitch them all together and link them to additional funding and replicate those models. And one of the reasons I bring this up is if you would like to hear about how some of these are working and how they work as sort of pieces of this collaborative governance network that we're building, we have those summaries of these case studies available and can get them to you if you'd like to see them. So part 2 will also include a section on strategies to address those individual threats to achieve healthy landscapes. And those strategies were brainstormed through a virtual facilitated process made necessary by COVID last summer. Susan Heyman, then with Enviro Issues, who's on the call today, led that process. And so we have a lot of that ready, but I bring it up here to say we don't, as part of this governance effort, need to address those individual strategies. We don't need to talk about how do we deal with invasive annual grasses or conifers or fire. We have those strategies developed and they're being worked on. We need to work on the network governance system that helps implement those strategies across scales and across ownerships. So that's something we don't need to spend time on. So the process that we're embarking on will contribute alternatives for a sagebrush conservation network governance that will be included in part 2 of the Sagebrush Conservation Strategy. And this was an interesting graphic that came out of a report that was funded. I forget if it was BLM or the service funded this project through WAFWA with Patrick Bixler and Sean Johnson. And these are 509 entities who self-identified as being involved in sagebrush conservation and attempts to show their linkages to one another. And this is what we're trying to develop, this collaborative governance system to sort of make sense of, if you will. And those 509 organizations were categorized into academia, NGOs, private sector organizations, local agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, and if there were 509 that self-identified as being engaged in sagebrush conservation, there are probably many more that deal with invasive plants or own land or whatever that maybe didn't self-identify, but are certainly part of our network or should be in the future. So there's a lot of folks out there that we can stitch together. So that led us to a partnership with the Udall Foundation to help identify potential models for governance of the Sagebrush Conservation Network, recognizing that we don't necessarily have the skill to do the kinds of things that they do. We don't, well, it's helpful to have a third party neutral to do the interviews and the assessments, because we would bring our own biases and certainly not trying to predetermine any outcomes. So the Udall Foundation has been really helpful and tremendous in this effort. So I want to conclude. Whoops. I lost your slide, Ken. Here we go.
Oh, that's okay.
Not going to let me back into it. Can you talk from there, Ken? This is
sure. Real quickly, this is Ken Mayer. Work for WAFWA. I've been since 2013 working on invasives and fire and coordinating the initiative. But Tom and I wanted to put this slide in here to really drive home the point how complex this issue really is. We put this what we call the Medusa head slide together when we were first developing the assessment of invasives in the West in 2015. And I just asked a simple question: who are the agencies, all the agencies that have something to do with invasive management in the sagebrush biome? And as you can see, there's a ton of them. And then how do they interact and how they related to one another? And we realize that we can do a good job of doing the assessment and developing a suite of strategies to address those issues. But we need to figure out how to put all that together. This is just invasives. If you can imagine, a lot of this is similar for fire, would be with some other players that are not listed here. But each one of these steps as we go along the way is incredibly diverse. And that's why it was just critical in our mind that we get an organization like the Udall Foundation to help us look at this governance of this morass, if you will, of all these different organizations that have something to do or involvement in sagebrush management. So anyway, with that, I want to belabor that, but I'd like to turn that over to the Udall folks.
Thank you, Ken and Tom, for setting that up for us. And I just want to see, I see there's a couple questions in the chat. I just want to also offer for folks, if they want to, you could certainly put questions in the chat. There's also a Q&A box if you want to put questions there, and you can also upvote them if there's particular questions you agree with that you want to see answered. So we'll be monitoring that. But I see there's a question here about whether there are any tribal agencies that were identified as kind of being involved in the network.
Yeah, this is Tom. My Zoom seems to be freezing up on me. I know that slide that I showed showed in that local agency, the top box, and this was just a clip of, you know, obviously that table went on and on and on. This was just a screenshot of the top, what, five or six. So the Burns-Paiute Tribe Natural Resource Department, I think you could include all of the tribal natural resource departments in there. I don't really know, you know, this was not my study. I don't really know what other tribal entities might have identified themselves. I'm sure there were some, but I'm also, to be honest, this started from the Sage West listserv, and the process that Patrick used was an iterative query. So we had the Sage West listserv, which is a list of all of the people that at least the Sage West communications folks knew were engaged in sagebrush conservation. And we asked that initial, or not we, Patrick Bixler and Sean asked the original contactees to identify others. And they did that, I think, like 3 different times. So ultimately they came up with 509. But I don't know what other ones. I can certainly check on that, and we can get back to them. That information is available. I just don't have it in front of me.
Right,
yeah, thanks, Tom. This is Sean. I just was going to say the same thing, that this was an iterative snowball sample that started from that communications list. And I was just trying to look it up here in real time, and I couldn't find the last list either. I have the one that was this second round, 386 names or something like that, and couldn't find any additional tribes beyond the Burns-Paiute right now, but I'm guessing that there are a couple more that showed up in that. But part of the reason to do a social network analysis is to identify gaps. And so if that ends up being one that we think is an important one, I'm guessing it is, then that's one of the reasons why we did this as an initial check-in across the different communities who are engaged in sagebrush conservation. And it is just simply an input into this conversation around governance. What does that tell us about who's currently involved, both within existing networks and structures, but also helping us think about those questions about who might we have missed and how can we fill those gaps?
Great, thank you. And I also see there's a question about, can we get a link to the slides? So I'm wondering, would it be okay, Tom, to send these around to the participants afterwards?
Yeah, we recorded this, right? So they could.
Yeah, we'll have the recording. So if folks would like the slides, seems like we could attach that too. That's okay. All right. So well, thank you to Tom and Ken for kind of setting things up here and getting us started. So I'm Dana Goodson with the Udall Foundation and the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. So really pleased to be here with all of you. And just wanted to do, before we kind of dive in further, just a quick round of intros. So you kind of know who we have here on the panel. And you've met both Tom and Ken from WAFWA. And then, so first we want to kind of introduce you to the core team who's really been guiding this effort so far. So we'll kind of do a quick round. If those of you on the core team, we'll go through, if you could just kind of briefly share your, title, organization, and, why it is that you or your organization have felt that it's really important to be involved in this effort so far. So since we started with WAFWA, let's continue. San, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, good afternoon. Sam Stiver. I'm the Sagebrush coordinator for WAFWA, and essentially lead the effort on sagebrush conservation. I've been interested in sagebrush my whole life, and my family goes back to the 1850s. in sagebrush country. So a long history and interest.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Karen, would you like to go next?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Karen Prentice. I'm the Bureau of Land Management's National Science Advisor today. I've been engaged with this effort since 2014 when we launched the Next Step conference in Boise that was intended to help us think about sage-grouse restoration and also the restoration of the sagebrush biome. As Tom mentioned earlier, one of the responsibilities that came out of that was the responsibility to develop a conservation and restoration strategy for the sagebrush biome. That was tasked to BLM, and it's been my responsibility since then. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Pat, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'm Pat Dagger with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the Sagebrush Ecosystem Science Coordinator for the agency. I've been working in sagebrush for the Fish and Wildlife Service for the past 23 years. Fish and Wildlife Service really recognizes the value of looking at ecosystems and looking at large landscapes, including the human inhabitants there, because that is where we're going to have our conservation success. And by embracing a partnership, looking at those landscapes, we can get away from that single species management and look at healthy landscapes instead.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Allie, would you like to go?
Yes, I just want to say it's so great to see all the names in this meeting, familiar friends and names. Allie Duvall, Director of Strategic Partnerships with Intermountain West Joint Venture. I just want to speak on behalf of our organization and the why for engagement here. We are a bird and wildlife conservation partnership in the West that really for bird habitat conservation, we have about 80 to 90% of the sagebrush habitat in North America is within the joint venture's geography. So back in 2010, it was a sort of, we must really engage on sage-grouse and sagebrush habitat conservation. There was a moment in time, we've been working with the EOC, and there was a moment in time a couple of years ago when I can remember Tom was standing in front of the EOC and really talking about the crisis that we face with this ecosystem. And also at the same time, there was a lot of transition going on around the challenges in the system, some transitions going on at that table. And Intermountain West Joint Venture, our board a couple of years ago basically said, right after that meeting, we need to spend some time thinking about partnership with EOC in a way that can really help with implementation. And so we felt that EOC's role in being that important body for policy and the authority with respect to the states, the federal agencies, that there was also a need for broader inclusion of partners, the energy around funding, capacity, and implementation, and certainly a need to address fire and invasives. So I just offer all of that because you'll see references to Intermountain West Joint Venture, and I think we have a committee that is basically 2 years old that has really been working in partnership with EOC in a way that I think is part of this whole story of how do we think about governance into the future. But we're super excited about it and the report that you're about to see shortly.
Thanks, Allie. And Sean.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be a part of this. I know everyone doesn't need another Zoom meeting in their lives, but we're really glad you're here. My name's Sean Johnson. I'm with the University of Montana, where I am currently the managing director of a small applied research center, the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. Here for a couple of reasons. One, I was privileged to be a part of that team working with Patrick Bixler, Mo Essen, and Jen Thompson, where we conducted that social network analysis of organizations connected to the sagebrush ecosystem, and really see that as an input into this broader conversation on governance. So I'm glad to be a part of the continued conversation and really see that need to figure out the governance piece. Second, as a matter of research and practice, I focus on large landscape conservation and stewardship efforts, currently the co-chair of the National Network for Landscape Conservation. And there the goal is to really link and connect and leverage existing efforts across scales, integrate diverse information, data, and include diverse perspectives, which I think is exactly the task in front of us. And third, Karen Prentice asked me to be here, and I don't say no to Karen. So that's probably really why I'm here.
It's a good motivation. Okay. Thanks, Sean. So just to also, the rest of us who are on this call are part of the facilitation team. So myself, my colleagues, Melanie and Monique, and we also have Susan Heyman as part of our facilitation team that from Raw Strategic, and some of you know her from previous meetings. So with that, I just want to mention that some of the documents, the reports that we'll be talking about shortly went around on email. So hopefully you have those documents on email, if in the email that was sent with a reminder for this meeting. And if not, we are planning to post them to the WAFWA page shortly. So we'll let you know when that happens. But other than that, I think last piece of logistics is feel free to put questions in the chat and the question and answer, and we will keep an eye on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie. So we'll get started on talking about the results of our research.
Okay, thanks, Dana. So just to give you a sense of who we are at the Udall Foundation and how we got linked in to support this work and into this group. So we're an independent federal agency, so we're a third party. We're actually based in the executive branch, and the overall mission of our foundation is to strengthen federal agencies and Native nations and work with a wide range of stakeholders on environmental, natural resources, and public lands issues. And so we at the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution are one program of the Udall Foundation. And some of you may have heard of us in the past as the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution. We underwent a name change. I think we're still getting used to it ourselves, but you may have heard of us in that name as well. And so our mission at the National Center is really to work on different collaboration, consensus building, and conflict resolution processes. So really working on complex environmental and public policy issues where there's multi-party collaboration, multi-party problem solving, helping parties to work together, build a shared understanding of issues, and develop strong outcomes. And we do that by addressing environmental disputes, and we also build capacity to address those challenges in a training and capacity building program. So we have a range of different services. So we do assessments, and you'll hear the results of the assessment we did for this process. We convene different meetings. We are mediators and facilitators. And as I mentioned, we have a training program as well. And we have different leadership activities. We work a lot on implementing Section 101 of NEPA. Much of our work involves Native American and Alaska Native tribes, and we also facilitate the federal ECCR forum. And so a number of different areas. And we've done work both geographically and issue-wise broadly. So working on issues such as national and regional ocean planning. We've also worked with the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, which occurs at a regional level across 8 states. And it has a stakeholder committee of nearly 70 members of federal agencies, states, tribes, and a variety of different stakeholder groups. So our role in supporting this work has been to put together 2 different reports. And we'll be working with you all in the process that evolves after this webinar. So first, we completed an assessment report, and then we also did a review of models of different large landscape collaborative conservation models, and looked at what are some of the key aspects of those models and how might they relate to different aspects of a sagebrush governance partnership system. So first, we'll talk about the assessment report that we completed, and that was one of the documents that was sent out to you in advance of the webinar, and one of the documents that we'll be posting on the website, so you'll be able to access it after this. So really just to kind of touch base on the big picture of what are the purposes of an assessment report. So our aim was really to understand the range of perspectives on the issues and to share them back with the group for collective understanding. So it's not an evaluation or an analysis of the different solutions that were raised. It's really a starting point for collaborative work, a place to check in and see what's there. And out of that can be recommendations and themes that are synthesized. So some specific goals of this particular Sagebrush assessment were to identify what's working well already within Sagebrush network governance. Identify where there's barriers that exist. So where do we see things that get in the way of coordination? Identify recommendations for additional strategies, and then also assess support for the anticipated partnership model proposal development, group member composition, and identify any gaps. So to do this, we worked with the core team, who is represented by everyone on the webinar today. So members of WAFWA, IWJV, University of Montana, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the BLM. So really think about what's the scope and what's the approach for this assessment. So we put together a list of interviewees, we developed interview questions, and then we talked about an approach for reporting on the results. So in the end, we contacted 26 representatives from 20 different organizations, and we ended up interviewing 19 individuals representing 15 different organizations in the 2-month period between December and January 2021. The core team developed a list of standardized questions that we asked each interviewee, and also developed a preamble, which was read to all interviewees at the beginning of each interview to set the scene. And so we asked a standard set of questions, and we also asked additional follow-up questions that emerged unique to each dialogue with the interviewees. So we found a number of findings from what we heard from interviewees. So first, we asked about the Sagebrush Executive Oversight Committee, or the EOC. What we heard from most interviewees was that there are limitations to how much the EOC can accomplish within its current structure, and that a broader membership would be needed to go beyond, for efforts that would go beyond information sharing. There was some disagreement about whether the current composition of the EOC needs to change. Several folks stated that it really depends on the purpose and what EOC would like to do. So challenges that were noted were consistent prioritization from its membership, continuity of effort, consistent priority, and connection to work on the ground and those doing work at the local level. So we also asked interviewees if their organization's Sagebrush effectiveness would be enhanced if there was a leadership body. So whether that be the EOC or another coordination or leadership body that was doing the following sorts of things. So developing a common set of objectives, a common prioritization scheme, monitoring an adaptive management system, and also facilitating access to the latest science. So the most common response that we heard was, yes, that would be helpful, with a caveat. And the largest caveat really centered around a partnership system that would allow for localized tailoring and autonomy, and avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach, recognizing that there's many different individual cultures of different areas in the sagebrush biome, and that there's a need for balancing that autonomy with a larger partnership model. So there were a range of views that we heard from fully supportive to a few who felt that a partnership governance entity wasn't needed. So we asked interviewees about different barriers to effective sagebrush conservation. And what we heard is summarized on this list. So we heard a variety of different themes. So, one is the challenge of public perception and challenges to seeing the sagebrush as a system to conserve, seeing the importance of it, feeling connected to that. Different data and monitoring limitations, insufficient staffing and inconsistent funding, inconsistent and insufficient priority, and most of these centered around capacity issues. We did hear a lot about different threats to the biome, so invasive plants and fires, et cetera, were all mentioned as different barriers. And interviewees also mentioned different aspects of learnings from other successful collaborative efforts. So we heard about things like investing in storytelling. So really discussing what's working well, where are their successful projects, inclusion of local people throughout, attention to why people participate, what incentivizes participation with in any collaborative effort. And some of the aspects that we've mentioned previously, so dedicated staffing, and this idea of broad and diverse partnerships that they've been hearing about, and an ecosystem focus rather than a single species focus. So we asked about what the critical actions are that would be needed from each of a variety of different entities. So for federal agencies, what we heard is that leadership and priority setting would be critical actions from federal agencies, as well as dedicated and consistent funding. For tribal agencies, what we heard is that tribes and indigenous knowledges are often left out of planning and coordination processes. We heard from interviews it's critical the tribes need to be included in the process and very likely are interested in participating. And also that sagebrush conservation needs to reflect tribal cultural values and needs, and that these kinds of values need to be integrated into the prioritization processes and planning that occurs. For states and state agencies, we heard a number of different critical actions, primarily really highlighting the unique role of states to coordinate and facilitate across partner organizations. So this can also occur through committing resources on a sustainable basis and also influencing leadership commitment to lessen the impact of political pendulum swings. And for private sector and landowners, we heard that the critical actions needed were to be willing to represent your issues and interests within a common venue. So really being willing to come to the table and represent your issues and interests. So there were a number of different interviewee recommendations for sagebrush conservation governance, and we split them into the themes on the slide. So those were around inclusive representation within a partnership governance system and thinking about large landscape conservation efforts, connecting the landscape level coordination to local work that's being done on the ground. There were a number of suggestions around data and monitoring, and also the need to prioritize landscapes to know where to focus resources first. We also asked about for panel member suggestions for the process that's going on, for the advisory committee, for the drafting work group, who should be part of this process. And then also pointing to the need for dedicated staffing and then attention to on-the-ground empowerment and incentives. So building on the themes we heard from the interviewees, we came to 4 key areas of focus to think about in developing a partnership governance model for sagebrush. And we'll go through each of them one by one. So the first theme that really came through was building on successes and leaving room for innovation. So we heard strongly from interviewees that there's a lot in sagebrush conservation that's working really well. And what's needed is to learn from and build on those successes while also working to address any gaps. We also heard that efforts to date haven't been sufficient to conserve sagebrush on a massive scale, and that creativity and unprecedented efforts will be required to increase the scope of the work that's been occurring. And then benefits of building on what's working well and highlighting successful efforts lead to a number of positive attributes. So building momentum and rapport, increasing support and bipartisan support, gaining media attention, and also celebrating milestones within what is a longer term conservation process. So the second theme was around continuity, dedicated resources, and staffing. So as we noted in what we heard from the interviewees, inconsistent and insufficient staffing and priority have been significant barriers for sagebrush conservation efforts. And so any governance model for success would need to have mechanisms to ensure long-term priority and continuity, both as individuals change within staffing, and then also as administrations change and evolve, as well as having a dedicated and sufficient source of funding and dedicated staff to lead the effort. So the third theme was around broad participation at all levels and also coordination across those scales. So first, what really came through from interviewees was the need for this diverse, inclusive, and broad partnership. And that a wide range of perspectives are needed to really successfully coordinate these efforts across landscapes. So we asked folks what would incentivize participation at different scales. And what we heard was that at the grassroots scale, individuals are incentivized to participate if the conservation efforts align with their missions and if it brings more resources to the table. And we also heard the importance of connecting sagebrush conservation work to connection to the land and also to why people care, that's a critical piece of incentivizing participation. At the agency level, we learned that people were motivated to participate if they were given direction and priority by their leadership. Knowing that there are many other priorities, so if there's competing priorities, it can be more difficult to focus in. So that support is critical. Some other aspects of broad participation. So this partnership governance model, our models, we really need to have a mission that encompasses those of working on the ground and also engages high-level agency leadership in a sustainable and ongoing way. And we heard a lot about the balance between the large-scale planning and the regional and local level autonomy and implementation. And also the recognition that different kinds of organizations have different strengths to bring to the table. So it might be access to funding. It might be serving as a bridging organization. It might be the ability to administer contracts quickly. And so really capitalizing on those different strengths and building those into a governance model or models. And the fourth theme centered around data monitoring and landscape prioritization considerations. And we heard a need for prioritization of landscapes so that resources that are available for sagebrush conservation can be used in the most effective way possible. And we also heard about numerous challenges that exist around data and monitoring systems. So the use of different matrices, keeping track of all the data, different data collection methods or reporting. And we also heard that monitoring can be burdensome and there can be challenges with collecting data around disturbances. So we heard a number of different challenges with data and monitoring as a whole. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Dana to talk with us about the research report.
Thanks, Melanie. So on our research report on partnership models, you can go ahead and advance the slide. What we set out to do there was to really take a look at what are some of the successful partnerships that are out there and what can they teach us about the design of a potential partnership model for the sagebrush system. Next slide. And so in order to do that, we didn't, it's important to note we didn't kind of do a comprehensive review of all the large landscape partnerships that are out there and evaluate them. Rather, we tried to focus in on some models that we thought could be particularly instructive for what the group is trying to do in the sagebrush biome. So we identified some characteristics that we thought would be helpful for us, and looked for a set of partnership models that had those characteristics. So things we thought would be useful are things like having a shared vision, goals, and objectives that oriented the collaborative group, having a sufficiently long time in operation to show that the organization can show some results. So those types of characteristics were the things that that you see listed here, or things we were looking for when trying to identify some models. You can go to the next slide. And at the same time that we were doing that, we were also reviewing the literature on collaborative governance, looking into that research to see what it could tell us about what are some of the successful models for a collaborative partner. Sorry, what are some of the factors of success for collaborative partnerships? So in that review, we were able to identify these 7 assessment factors that we we looked at in each of the models that we identified. So we kind of reviewed each model against these factors to see kind of what were they doing, in terms of balance and inclusive representation, what were they doing with leadership and staffing, et cetera. The next slide. So once we kind of had some recommendations, and from our research, we had about 15 potential partnerships to look at, and then we narrowed it down based on the characteristics we were looking for to some key models. And those 3 main key models that we kind of did more in-depth research on were the North American Waterfall Management Plan, or NAWAMP, and the associated joint ventures. So there are many joint ventures, but the 2 that we looked at were the Intermountain West Joint Venture and the Playa Lakes Joint Venture. The other 2 main models that we looked at were the Northwest Boreal Partnership, as an example of one of the landscape conservation cooperatives and how that has evolved, and the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. So those are the 3 main models that we did a little bit more in-depth research and did some interviews around those. We also recognize that there are some other models that, partnership models that, while they didn't really touch on all of the factors that we were trying to review, they still had some, they still had some things to teach us on some of the factors. And so we looked into these 4 here with kind of a focus on some of those factors that they really well illustrated. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Monique to talk about, just give you a brief sketch of some of what those, what we learned about each of those models.
Yeah. So so we'll just briefly look through these and what their strongest aspects were for each. And again, these are covered more in depth, both in the research report. There's a big write-out on each one of them, and there's also a table that summarizes each of the 7 factors that we looked at. So NAWAMP it's an international plan with overarching direction and vision, coming from a high level in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And all of the implementation really is happening through that framework of about 22 joint ventures. So with NAWAMP, I will highlight that they have 3 really clear goals. As an organization, they have a science support team that helps root those goals and the actions in best science. And they also are funded by NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. And I will point out that NAWAMP was built before NACA was ever passed in the US, and it nonetheless provided that financial stability through decades. And if we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned, one of the JVs that we looked at was Intermountain West Joint Venture. Its boundaries overlap mostly with the sagebrush biome, and they have adopted a strong sagebrush conservation focus. So the things that I want to highlight about IWJV that we found to be most prominent was this relentless focus on broadening the conservation frame to bring together diverse partners and funders and projects. And I'll point out that they had 72% of their income last year coming from partner contributions, and they fund 13 staff positions that help move IWJV work along. Next slide. And the other joint venture that we looked at, the Playa Lakes Joint Venture, is recognized for their innovation, particularly in bringing diverse partners to the table. What they have been able to do is develop their this essential scientific understanding of the Playa's role in the aquifer recharge and human relationships to the Playas, to be able to lead to very innovative partnerships with people that may not otherwise care about this effort. And one of those examples is recognizing early on that the wind industry would have potential significant impact on the Playa landscape. And so they've really built relationships with the wind industry. Members are also, well, one thing that was really highlighted for us when we were studying this is that members are generally committed to the work of the joint venture, mostly because it already aligns with their own missions of their organizations. Next slide. And the Northwest Boreal Partnership, this was formerly a landscape conservation cooperative, one of the roughly 22 conservation partnerships that were the LCCs. They were, like most LCCs, had lost their funding support through that program a few years ago. And at that time, they transitioned into this new partnership entity. And the things to point out about the Northwest Boreal Partnership.
Oh, Monique, did we lose you? I think we did. Let's see. She's the host, though. We can't lose our host. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we will get her back there in a minute. Monique, let us know if you're back on. Melanie, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll try to step in for Monique while she's. Yeah, it looks like she had some connection issues. So just, you know, some of the things that really struck us with the Northwest Boreal partnership is the real effort that they are making to work with Indigenous partners, and they're doing that from, you know, so Monique started to talk about how they, you know, they're kind of restarting in a sense, kind of with new funding and so on. And while they're doing that, they're also really investing in these new partnerships with Indigenous partners. And so that's helping them kind of revision their strategic plan, just recognizing that broadening the frame and bringing in different viewpoints, particularly traditional Indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge, that is a more holistic view than they may have had in the past. And so bringing that in requires kind of some work to kind of rethink strategies and so on. So they're engaged in doing that. Monique, are you back? Let me know.
So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was just picking up on the point of bringing in Indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge. So that's where I stopped.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Dana. Yeah. So if we can go, yeah, I don't know if she touched on this, but just an example of that is that they are bringing in Indigenous-led land use planning, for example. And then I think we can go to the next slide. So the last sort of large model that we looked at in depth was the Chesapeake Bay Program. This is an agreement between Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia governors, Mayor of DC, the EPA administrator, and the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. And the things that I'll really pull out from this model in particular is that they have goals that link outcomes and deadlines that they review every 2 years on a 2-year cycle. They have significant funding from EPA appropriations that are very stabilizing for this organization. And they have a hierarchical structure headed by these governors and the mayor and those listed that are on the agreement that really give a lot of weight to this work. And then if we could go to the next slide. And just very briefly for time, just want to touch on these for the Chesapeake, or the Blackfoot Challenge is just a public-private collaborative watershed management organization in Montana and a bit of Canada. The roundtable on the Crown of the Continent is also in Montana and parts of Canada, and it's stitching together over 100 organizations, governmental, tribes and First Nations, NGOs, and they're looking at land use and climate issues. And then next slide. And I'll start at the bottom. The Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy is in Southeast US and the Caribbean, and they're looking at protecting land and at-risk species for climate change and overdevelopment. And I also want to point out back to the top, National Invasive Species Council, although NISC did not meet our model selection criteria, there were clear lessons learned that we really wanted to include in this report and that we thought were useful, specifically around having unclear goals and insufficient funding. And so we mentioned them mostly as a lessons learned, but all of those, again, are more in depth in the report, and we'll now go to the findings of what we drew out of all of these models. So I'll hand it back to Dana.
Great, thank you, Monique. So after doing our review of the models and also the our look at the collaborative governance literature, we tried to pull together some findings that we thought would be helpful in setting up a potential collaborative governance partnership in the sagebrush biome. So in terms of findings around each of our factors, for goals and measurable impact, we saw that it was really important to have a compelling vision and shared goals, as well as methods to track progress against those goals. So many of the organizations we looked at were doing so and often using an adaptive management system to adjust over time. Monique mentioned the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, which established a long-term goal of 10% improvement in Southeastern ecosystem function by 2060, and it has interim goals to track along with that, and it records progress against that annually. So the CCAS, or the acronym for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, it really observed that having that kind of a singular goal would really help to attract new partners and collaboration opportunities, as well as funding. So it's pretty effective for them. So at the same time, we also heard a bit of caution here in terms of over-reliance on quantitative metrics. We saw that there was some caution there, just because didn't want to over-rely on those metrics given the complexity of the ecosystems and landscapes that we're talking about. Also recognizing the importance of offsetting declines. So even if the progress isn't being made to the level of the goal, still there can be a real importance in kind of keeping declines from sort of over being overwhelming, I suppose. And then also there can be issues with kind of accurately tracking and accurately measuring. So while these metrics can be important for helping to focus efforts and keep people moving in a direction, it's important not to kind of hang your hat on that too much, and also take kind of a longer term holistic view of the qualitative outcomes. Next slide. So balanced and inclusive representation, that was really a hallmark of the collaborative partnerships that we were looking at. Many of the partnerships really credited having such broad and inclusive representation with bringing not only needed expertise and resources to the table, but also innovation and new sources of funding. So it really brought in some strengths. In particular, as an example, both of the JVs that we looked at, that really emphasize bringing in a broad range of partners, also work to kind of broadly conceptualize their goals, and that helped to bring in new partners. And we think we touched on, for example, the Playa Lakes Joint Venture that when they developed an understanding of the role of the playas in aquifer recharge, they were able to bring in partners who wouldn't necessarily be interested in bird conservation otherwise, but groups like the agricultural community and municipalities who are interested in the aquifer for drinking water. So really helped to expand their partnership that way. The Intermountain West Joint Venture did something similar in determining the real key role of irrigated wet meadows for bird conservation, and were able to engage in some partnerships with landowners in the agricultural community. One thing to note is that not all of the partnerships that we looked at were necessarily had success in engaging with Indigenous or other historically marginalized communities. And as Monique noted when we went through the slides, that particularly the Northwest Boreal and the Crown of the Continent have been doing that, and working closely with Indigenous communities. And of course, in the case of the Northwest Boreal, it's calling for a revision of what their effort and their strategic plan, to make sure they're incorporating their partnerships. And they found that to be really advantageous in terms of giving them a more holistic view of both the issues and the potential solutions. So it's signaling that that's really important to do that kind of at the outset of when you're setting up your partnership, and investing the necessary time and resources to do so. So, helping support the capacity for engagement, which can take more time. All right, next slide. In terms of needed access to knowledge and scientific or technical information, these models that we looked at definitely had a focus on that and recognized the importance of science-based decision-making. And so they had a variety of methods for bringing scientific and technical information to bear. So it might be, perhaps they had scientific advisory committees or scientific and technical experts who are on staff or available for consultation. They conducted studies, scientific studies to help determine what the priorities of the collaborative should be, used adaptive management framework, and so on. It's also worth noting that there seemed to be not only an emphasis on kind of the hard science and technical information, but also a movement towards incorporating other types of knowledge and information, such as cultural, social, and economic knowledge. In NAWAMP, for example, I think we mentioned they have a human-centered goal that's around better understanding what motivates the public to become involved in conservation. And of course, that played a role in the examples I mentioned earlier about understanding the human relationship to the playas and the irrigated wet meadows. And then, of course, there's, as we mentioned, the examples of the Crown and the Continent and Northwest Boreal that are focused on integrating both indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge into their work. Next slide. And sufficient and sustainable funding. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? It's really clear that it's going to be important to have a sufficient funding in order to sustain the collaborative body over time. So the question is really how were they doing that in these different organizations? And really what we saw is that a number of them would have kind of a core base of federal funding, that they would really expand upon that to diversify that funding. So expand their base and establish kind of a stable funding source over a longer time. So certainly they drew on their partnerships in order to do that. Partners were often, instrumental in bringing funding for implementation projects to the table. Board members would contribute or help with fundraising, or partners would provide grants for implementation projects. So there was a variety of ways to do that and kind of working with the partnership. Also, it also helps to kind of think creatively. We heard an example that during the development of NAWCWA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, there was a recognition that there was an excise tax on ammunition and firearms from the Pittman-Robertson Act, and that pot of money was kind of accruing interest. It was, the funds from the excise tax were deposited in accruing interest, and that interest could be taken and used for funding waterfowl conservation efforts. So there's some value in kind of thinking broadly about where can those funds come from. The next slide. So for leadership and staffing, we definitely saw some examples of how high-level leadership can be a really important driver in bringing people together and keeping people motivated and sustained over the long term. The Chesapeake Bay was certainly an example that we touched on, with having the governors and the mayor and the EPA administrator involved and continuing to meet annually. And those annual meetings really bring focus and direction to the entire effort. So there seemed to be some real value in having that engagement of high-level leadership. Certainly, as we heard in the assessment, that having dedicated staffing, dedicated coordinators who are doing the day-to-day work of managing the partnership and the communication and coordination efforts is really essential to making the partnership work. We saw that in the organizations we looked at, sometimes that was filled by agency staffing, and sometimes it was filled by independent staffing, and it did seem to be viable in each case, although kind of hearing some of the things we heard about the potential for it to be complicating for the agency role. Perhaps it could be better to kind of separate those roles out and have the agency's role be separated from being staffing, and have them more on the convener and funder and expert side of things, rather than also be engaged in the staffing, as it can be kind of complicated for their role to be playing both those pieces. We also heard that there could be some real value in having independent neutral staff, as that helped with fundraising efforts as well. Next slide. So an approach to decision-making and conflict resolution. So most of these, or all of these partnerships that we were looking at, were voluntary, and therefore they took they tended to use consensus as their form of decision-making. And so kind of as these partnerships become larger and more complex, it can be really valuable to have a structured approach to decision-making, defining what it means, what consensus means. And there was a partnership, the Chesapeake Bay uses a consensus continuum to kind of define what consensus agreement means. So there's a range from, yes, I agree with this proposal, to, let's hit pause and figure out, there's some things we need to figure out about this proposal, to, I don't agree with this proposal, but I'm not going to hold it up to a no. And so having that kind of nuance and understanding of what consensus means can really help to move the process forward, as well as having defined decision-making procedures. Next slide. And in terms of relationships among participants, there was a real emphasis in the groups that we looked at about being attentive to potential partners' interests, and particularly at the outset, to understand, what are the shared goals that can speak to the range of relevant partners. So really important to take the time and invest to understand, what are the perspectives of those various partners, particularly in the beginning. And as one of our interviewees pointed out, so this is not a negligible piece of the puzzle. It's really important to, building those relationships is really important to sustaining the effort over time. So we had some suggestions about perhaps you do that through annual kind of retreat type workshops, or perhaps there are field trips, or there's other relationship building efforts that are taking place in the collaborative for the purpose of building trust and getting to know the partners. Next slide. And then finally, partnership structure was not one of the elements that we initially set out to look at, but as we were looking at these models, it emerged as something that's important to consider is really how the partnership is structured, how the leadership body relates to the organizational day-to-day coordination body to perhaps regional bodies and the work going on the local level or on the ground. So thinking through, who is at each of those different scales, how is the communication, how are the connections and communications working between those different levels, and what are the incentives for participating at each of those levels. So really kind of thinking that through and understanding the motivations for participation in a partnership. So these are the kinds, this type of question is about, incentives at the different scales, and the connections are the types of questions that we'll be asking in this process, to understand what would be, what kind of structure might work well in the sagebrush biome. Okay, and with that, I think we can open it to questions. Both on the assessment report that Melanie shared and the research that Monique and I covered.
Great. Okay, thanks, Dana and Monique. And it looks like we've got a couple questions in the chat box. And I was hurriedly typing in response to one, but I'll now just say it verbally. And so Brian had a question about how many of those interviewed were private landowners or public land operators. And just to give some sense of that, so in our assessment, our goal was to interview a broadly representative list of different individuals. And since there are so many players in sagebrush conservation at so many scales, what that meant is that we interviewed 1 to 2 individuals who could bring in different perspectives, with the understanding that we would be integrating additional individuals with those perspectives as the process continues. So we spoke with one rancher, and we spoke with a number of additional interviewees who work with lessees, with landowners, and could give a sense of that process as well. So that can give you a sense of who we interviewed. And then just to let you know, there's a full list of interviewees in Appendix A of the assessment report. I hope that speaks to that question, but kind of hold on to that, and we'll talk about what's coming up in the process and how all the opportunities to continue to engage. And then we also had a second question about what would the extent of involvement with Indigenous tribes' contribution to reports, data, tech, or TAC publishable contracts. And I think and I'm wondering if you can provide a little more information about the specifics of what you're looking for with that question. And it's G. Wolfen. So are you able to give us any more of a sense? And we can also bring you in verbally if it makes sense to ask that question live.
Yeah, and this is Tom. If I could ask, is that referring to the role in this process that UDAL is coordinating, or is it anticipating a role in our governance structure to be? Probably way too early to answer the latter question, since we don't know what that's going to be, but just a clarifying question.
Okay, great. And there's a note in the chat. So oftentimes tribes are not either compensated for involvement. So is there anything else that you want to add as part of that question? We can allow you to talk if you want to come in verbally.
Right.
So can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Hi. Yeah. So my name is Gregory Wolf, and I work with the Pit River Tribe. And so, oftentimes, when tribes are requested, whether it's through informational-based meetings or through consultation meetings, that there's a lack of compensation with some of the TEK or indigenous-based knowledge that is, passed along to the agencies or to the researchers or whatever else. And so, that's one issue that I've seen, but also had provided comments to our local BLM meetings, as well as the Forest Service and other federal agencies. as well as other organizations. And so I know it's very difficult to try to get tribes involved when you're trying to, do a scope of work or through the budgets or whatever else. But that's something that's been expressed within my tribe, by the majority of our tribal council is the request of involvement, but the lack of compensation or lack of being included into the budget. And so the comments that we have provided as well were just what was brought up earlier about being part of the scoping period when working on projects or whatever else, because a lot of indigenous peoples, that's where they're from, ground zero, and they see changes that are very subtle and minute to these immense changes that are very obvious. And so I think that there's a lot of value within the TEK as well as indigenous-based knowledge with some of these indigenous communities that are around these areas that you guys are performing these reports.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for raising that and highlighting the importance of how that fits into this overall picture. And it also aligns with what we heard in the assessment. That often the TEK and indigenous knowledges are not fully integrated into these processes. And also that was reflected on the research side. And I don't know, Dana, if there's anything you want to add from that piece.
Yeah, and I think, that's a really good point. Thank you, Greg. I think we did reflect that somewhat, I think, in the sense of acknowledging that for to have indigenous involvement and traditional ecological knowledge, bringing that to the table, that perhaps additional resources are going to be needed, and for the reasons that you're indicating, right? It's tribes are they're being pulled in many different directions, many demands on them, and if they're being asked to contribute knowledge, then it may require resources, and so that is something that we noted in the report, kind of generally, but I think that's great to tease that out. I see Christina is also agreeing. Yeah, they need support in order to collaborate. Yes, thank you, Christina. That's a great point. And I don't recall, and maybe Monique does, whether we specifically heard if Crown of the Continent or Northwest Boreal have paid stipends or so on for involvement of tribes or indigenous groups. Monique, do you remember?
I don't on Crown of the Continent. On Northwest Boreal, it was something of a discussion and setting aside funds for, especially for travel, when necessary, support for travel. But that just quickly became fairly irrelevant during COVID. But that was part of the discussion and part of the early conversations as they were getting up and running with their own budgets.
Yeah. Christina also is pointing out the issue of sovereignty rights for sharing information. And that is a really good point too, that confidentiality would need to be respective. The Crown of Continent does not compensate. Okay, but it's something, I think that's a great point and something to think about. If this Sagebrush partnership is wanting to do this kind of and it seems like there is a real interest in it from what we heard in the assessment to bringing in tribes and indigenous groups, then it needs to be considered, are there sufficient resources to help support that engagement? So that's a really good point. All right, other questions, Melanie, that we should?
Yeah, it looks like we've got two more in the chat box, and Brett's one of your questions. I'm also seeing your note you have to drop off, so maybe we'll get this to you in the recording and we can also follow up. So the question was, did anyone raise or get into the role of creating a compact, in parentheses, federally designated / Congress might play in governance, or the role that the Western Governors Association might play? I'll speak from the assessment side first. So in the assessment, we heard from a number of people how useful it was when there was a Western Governors Initiative around sage grouse, and how that focused the work and also coordinated between multiple states. And so we did hear that was a really supportive towards conservation efforts. We're keeping Western Governors Association apprised of these efforts and looking also to individual governors' offices to bring in some more strategies around those aspects. But just to speak to that piece. And then in terms of the assessment, no one specifically highlighted a compact. We're using that in this case. And Dana and Monique, I'm not sure if that came up at all on the research side.
Right. I mean, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, I don't know if you'd call it a compact, but it did seem to be a really important foundational agreement for the entire effort, and really kept everyone oriented. It seemed to play a really important role there. So that is one example. NAWAMP also has some of the legislation behind it. Monique, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I guess I would just say the legislation piece is most important for the funding aspect. So I don't know that NAWAMP is a great example for being a compact where the weight is coming from an agreement. I think where we saw that most was the Chesapeake Bay Program, where they do highlight how that is a steadying force throughout different administrations or different priority changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see there's a comment in here about sagebrush governance being a form of governing Indigenous peoples and public land ranchers. Well, so I think that's an important point to raise about the sort of the meaning of governance. I mean, it does make you think of governing, but that's not the intent here. This is a part of the voluntary partnership effort that we're discussing, and so that the governance would be sort of essentially how the partnership is managed. What sort of rules and processes and procedures do they use to organize themselves within this partnership? So nothing obligatory, sort of nothing obligatory about it, essentially. I hope that clarifies it. I don't know if anyone else wants to add in there.
Okay, so it looks like that gets us through the questions that were in the Q&A and also the chat. I'm thinking it might make sense. Oh, it looks like we got one more that just came in. So how do governance and governing intersect in this kind of a model? So good question. I'm going to see if anyone on the core team wants to speak to that first, kind of how you see those intersecting.
Okay, I'm willing. Tom, did you want to say something, or?
Well, I was hoping Sean could, because I think this very much gets into the technical definitions of governance and governing, and I sort of disagree. Unfortunately, Jim's questions points out that there are many synonyms or many applications of the term governance, and I think we mean it in the sense of stitching together voluntary collaborative efforts. And Brian's sort of point suggests that it's more than that, that it's actually governing, meaning imposing restrictions. And that's not at all where this is going. We still need tribes and ranchers involved, but not because we're going to be imposing restrictions on their use of permanent land or their tribal land or anything else. So I wanted to make that point. The other, I put a written response to Jim's question about adaptive management and monitoring. We do have a work group that will be, so there's several components to governance writ large, this collaborative governance. One is the structure of the entity and how they relate to one another in their decision-making processes. That's the piece that we're addressing. The other pieces are, what are the objectives and what would that look like in a system as big and complicated as the Sagebrush Biome? We have a work group that's taking that on as well. So that's sort of outside this process. It's integral in the end. Put my camera on. It's integral, and it's absolutely a part of the overall governance, but it's not the structural piece that this group is working on. So they're working on what overall objectives might look like for sagebrush conservation, clearly considering human needs, considering wildlife needs, but it's going to be based on not the sum of 720 species needs stapled together. It's going to have a ecological context to it. And that would then step down to a prioritization scheme for landscapes. Where do we need to work first, and what approach do we take into that work? So we have a group working on that. And then we also have another group that will take the adaptive management and monitoring chapter from part 1, which talks about the principles of adaptive management and monitoring, and suggest some alternative approaches that can be applied in support of those objectives for the sagebrush biome. So we have another group that's going to be working about that. If these topics are really intriguing to people and they want to contribute and they want to help out, let me know. We'd be happy to have you. We're just building those work groups now to do that work, but that will be proceeding on a parallel path with what we're doing on the governance structure itself. Mm-hmm. So did Sean have a good question on the governance versus governing, or a good response?
You want to just put me on the spot there, Tom?
Sure.
I'm sure half the people on the webinar here could come up with a pretty good answer or have a pretty good interpretation of that. But I think what we're looking for, and I think the distinction isn't so much between governing and governance. To me, those are a little bit synonymous, but we're not looking for government. We're not looking for kind of a formal structure right now. And I think the way that this is being presented in a lot of the literature on governance and different structures is that we're looking for the kind of mechanism, the support structure that can help facilitate a set of outcomes that we're working towards. And in this landscape, we're really working towards something that's much more about linking and connecting in partnerships. And because those are the objectives, we're looking for the structure that can help us achieve that. And if you look at governance or governing, there's usually a spectrum of different governance arrangements, from a very informal relationship-based, partnership-based, networked approach to something that ends up moving through that space of being connected through MOUs or different agreements of understanding, to something that does take on some of those more formal structures. All of those are different governance structures. The one that we're aiming for here is that more informal structure, in the sense that we want to connect, empower, support, and incentivize different efforts instead of have that command and control structure. Is that consistent with how you're thinking about it, Tom?
Yes, well said.
Great. Okay, well, it looks like there aren't any other questions in the chat at this point. So I'm thinking I'll pull the PowerPoint up so I can turn back to Dana and Susan to talk about next steps.
Great. Great. So where do we go from here in terms of figuring out what to, what steps need to be taken to come to a point of having a proposal around a potential partnership structure. And so hopefully many of you have seen this diagram already that's depicting what we think the process needs to happen in order to come up with this proposal. So the idea is at the end, at the end of this process in sort of early June, the groups that are working on this will, particularly the work group, will have a proposal for one or a couple perhaps of partnership models that they could recommend to the sagebrush community. Is okay, this is a type of model that could work for the sagebrush community to engage in a partnership, and hand that off as a proposal both to the EOC and the IWJV's Sagebrush Conservation Committee to help to then take it forward with next steps. So those sort of next steps would necessarily need to engage the larger sagebrush community in determining, is this a kind of partnership that you would want to engage in? So at this point, what we're trying to do in this phase right here is come up with that proposal. So there's different ways to engage, as you can kind of see the different levels here, and many of you are on this webinar because you are participating in the advisory committee or the work group, or you're thinking about participating in one of those. As you can see here, the advisory committee is in the kind of blue boxes. And so that's the group that will be providing input to the working group on what needs to go into this proposal for partnership models. So we've got two workshop meetings planned of the advisory committee, and then the work group is the one that'll be charged with incorporating that input and coming up with a proposal. And we have 3 meetings of the work group planned. And of course, I should mention that the work group members will be supported by staff, at UDAL and so on. So you aren't on the hook to do actual drafting unless you want to. Should of course be welcome, but there is support for that. And there's also another opportunity for engagement. So for those who aren't on the advisory committee or the work group, other members of the Sagebrush community who would like to weigh in on this effort, there are going to be some opportunities for that as well. And I'm going to turn to Susan to talk about the online comment piece of it.
Thank you, Dana. Appreciate that. And hello, and it is late in the afternoon for many of you, so I will be brief, but it is not unfamiliar for a number of you as I look at the participant list, the attendees list, to engage with the Sagebrush conservation effort online. We did a bunch of that last summer, and many of you, I'm guessing, participated in the online commenting that we did as part of that effort. So what we're doing here is similar. We have had this webinar. There's a workshop, or pardon me, there's a workshop that's going to be coming up, and we're going to try to get some information that we can use to help inform the drafting work group and the advisory committee. So on Friday, you should be receiving an email from the UDAL Foundation, and you will have a link in that email, and it will take you to something that looks a bit like what you're seeing on the screen. We call it an online comment tool. We're going to be asking just a short set of questions. Some of them will ask you to identify maybe things that are particularly important to you, or to identify scales at which there might be certain characteristics of partnership models that you think would work really well, or needs that you might have. Essentially, we're trying to take the information that the UDAL Foundation had in their assessment report and in their review of models for governance that they went over this afternoon, and try to drill in just a little bit further and ask you to help tease out some things from those findings. And then that information, again, will be provided to the drafting work group and to the advisory committee. So you'll get a link. That link will come with a little bit of context setting, and also links that will take you to the 2 reports that UDAL Foundation folks presented on today. If you do want to forward that email on to people who were not part of this webinar, you are certainly welcome to do that. We're going to ask for your responses by March 24th. And again, it shouldn't take a lot of time, but it would be very valuable to just get a little bit more thinking from you as we start to narrow things down. After March 24th, again, we'll synthesize the comments and we'll provide them to those work groups. And as you saw in Dana's illustration, the slide before, there is another online comment opportunity that is being contemplated, and we will be saying more about that as we get further down the road. So again, this is an example of a question that we'll ask that'll be an open-ended, because we know that many of you have a lot on your minds, and we want to be sure you have space to say it. So you'll have lots of room, and you can take what you need and get us some good stuff. If you have any questions, please let us know. Dana, I think that's all that I had on that.
Great, thank you, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say, apologize, it's getting dark here on the East Coast, so I feel like I'm looking kind of ominous in shadow here, so sorry about the lighting. In any case, we would like to hear if you have any other comments or questions, particularly about these next steps and opportunities for engagement, but also anything else that you have heard over the course of this webinar that you'd like to talk about. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left to address any questions that you might have. So please feel free to add those into the chat or raise your hand if you wanted to speak, or put them into the question and answer. I see a note here. We might have missed one earlier from Jim Leon's. Okay, so so I see a question here. How does one sum up the outcomes of these individual efforts to determine if progress is being made to achieve the overall objectives of these collaborative efforts? If progress is not being made, how does one get the collective effort on track to achieving that collective goal? So that is a really difficult and good question, Jim. And so, you know, what springs to mind for me is really the very involved and sort of detailed process that the Chesapeake Bay Program has for goal setting, implementation, and then tracking those goals against progress. And it is really a very complex and I think worth looking at system. It's called the Strategy Review System, and I think we touched on it when we talked about Chesapeake. That they kind of have a review of each of their goal areas every 2 years. So that's a really robust system that they developed over decades, really. And it was, you know, just from kind of looking at how that was developed, there were points where they were getting GAO reports saying that they weren't doing it sufficiently and they needed to revise it. So it really took some time to kind of come up with this system that now seems to be quite robust. So I think that, you know, to answer your question, I think that is a system that's worth looking at for inspiration to see if that kind of thing is helpful. But it's a difficult question. Anyone else like to weigh in on that question from Jim?
Yeah, Dana, this is Tom. I did type in a response, and then that's the one I attempted to answer earlier.
Oh,
the thing I would add, thinking about it a little bit more, is we will have a work group that's developing an adaptive management and monitoring construct or alternatives for one that it's in parallel to this effort. But I think relative to the structure of a governance model, we need to anticipate an adaptive management and monitoring construct. And so we need to build that in. And the complexity, of course, is going to be, we're dealing with the voluntary collaborative conservation side. A big piece of whether we meet sagebrush conservation goals is, of course, on the regulatory side. And we're going to have to, I don't know that we can resolve that other than to the extent that we develop. I mean, we need to take advantage clearly of DOI, existing monitoring efforts, state efforts on, you know, whatever the monitoring is going to look like. It's going to have a sagebrush component, landscape health component. It's going to have a wildlife component, because we're probably going to have objectives that relate to keeping, you know, things like sage grouse and pygmy rabbits at healthy levels and off the list. So we're going to take advantage of existing monitoring efforts led by state and federal agencies and integrate them. So I think to the extent that we can develop biome-wide goals for sagebrush conservation that maybe could be adopted by Interior, maybe even though we're not going to have a governance system that makes decisions about regulatory components, maybe the two can work together.
Great. Thanks, Tom. All right, any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I feel like maybe we're getting to a good point to wrap. So really pleased that you all were able to come and participate and listen. And I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. So just want to say, you know, on behalf of the entire core team, thanks so much for participating in the webinar. And we'll be in touch very soon, as you heard earlier in the webinar. So we'll post a recording. We were recording today. We'll also post the materials, so you'll be able to access those. We'll post both the report and also the webinar slides. And so keep an eye out for how to access that email, and welcome your comments in the online commenting process, in addition to however else you may be participating in the groups moving forward. So everyone can participate in the online comments, and we welcome your comments, and please also forward on to anyone in the sagebrush conservation community that you think would want to contribute there. So if you have any other follow-up questions, you can send it to any of us on this slide, to San, Dana, myself, or Monique, and we'll connect you and get those answered. So just again, want to say thanks so much, and we'll be in touch soon, and we'll be continuing to work with you all. So take care and have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.